The star athlete everyone loved was expelled, and the whole school destroyed him until his body was found. Ethan Volkov was standing in the principal's office when I saw him through the glass window on Monday morning, and I knew immediately something catastrophic had happened. His face was pale, his usually confident posture collapsed into something that looked broken. Principal Whitmore was speaking to him with an expression of cold disgust, and Vice Principal Raines stood beside her with arms crossed, watching Ethan with unconcealed contempt. I'd been Ethan's teammate and friend since freshman year, played point guard to his shooting guard on the varsity basketball team that had taken state championships 2 years running. He was the kind of person everyone gravitated toward naturally, not because he demanded attention, but because he made people feel valued. He'd stayed after practice 100 times to help younger players with their form. He'd organized fundraisers for families dealing with medical emergencies. He'd maintained a 3.9 GPA while carrying our team to rankings that put college scouts in our gym every week. When the office door opened and Ethan walked out flanked by 2 security guards, his face was completely blank. He didn't look at anyone in the hallway. The guards escorted him directly to his locker, watched him remove his belongings, and walked him out of the building. The whole process took maybe 10 minutes. I caught up with him in the parking lot and asked what was happening. He looked at me with eyes that seemed hollowed out and said, "They're saying I assaulted Vanessa Sterling. They're expelling me immediately. It's not true, Jeremy. I swear to you, it's not true." Then the guards told me to step back, and they put Ethan in his car and followed him off campus to ensure he left. Vanessa Sterling was a junior, quiet and academically focused, involved in student government and volunteering. I knew her peripherally from shared classes and school events, never heard anything negative about her character. By lunchtime, the rumor mill had filled in details that made my stomach turn. Vanessa had reported that Ethan had assaulted her at a party the previous weekend, that she'd been too traumatized to come forward immediately, but had finally told her parents on Sunday night. They'd gone directly to Principal Whitmore's home, and an emergency meeting had been convened early Monday morning. The school board had voted to expel Ethan pending police investigation, citing zero-tolerance policies for sexual violence. The story spread through Riverside Academy with the speed and viciousness that only high school gossip can achieve. By the end of the day, Ethan's Instagram was flooded with comments calling him a predator and a rapist. Someone had spray-painted "rapist" across his car windshield while it was parked in the school lot. His younger sister Mira, who was a freshman, got shoved in the hallway by a group of girls who told her that her brother was scum. The basketball team group chat, which had been active daily with jokes and game strategy, went completely silent. Nobody wanted to be associated with him. I wanted to believe Ethan was innocent because he was my friend, but I also knew that predators could be charming and well-liked. The statistics about sexual assault were clear. False accusations were rare. Victims needed to be believed. Everything I'd learned about supporting survivors told me that doubting Vanessa's claim was harmful and wrong. So I stayed silent when people in the cafeteria discussed what they wanted to do to Ethan. Stayed silent when his face was photoshopped onto wanted posters and circulated online. Stayed silent when Coach Thornton announced that Ethan's name was being removed from our championship banners and his records were being expunged from school history. I told myself that staying neutral was the right position until the investigation concluded, but really, I was protecting myself from association with someone everyone had decided was guilty. Ethan's parents hired a lawyer and issued a statement maintaining his innocence, saying the accusation was false and motivated by reasons they couldn't yet disclose. That statement made everything worse. People interpreted it as typical predator deflection, attacking the victim's credibility instead of taking accountability. The harassment of Ethan's family intensified. Someone threw a brick through their living room window. Their house was egged repeatedly. Mr. Volkov's accounting business lost several major clients who didn't want to be associated with a rapist's father. The police investigation moved slowly, while the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. Vanessa gave a detailed statement to detectives, describing the assault with specificity that seemed credible and devastating. She said Ethan had cornered her in an upstairs bathroom at the party, that she'd said no repeatedly, that he'd used his physical strength to overpower her. Multiple witnesses confirmed that both Vanessa and Ethan had been at the party. A few people remembered seeing them talking earlier in the evening. Nobody had seen them go upstairs together, but that didn't disprove Vanessa's account since people at parties weren't monitoring everyone's movements. The physical evidence was inconclusive. Vanessa had showered before reporting, which was understandable given trauma responses. The lack of physical evidence didn't mean nothing had happened, just that prosecution would rely primarily on testimony. The district attorney's office was reviewing the case to determine if charges would be filed. In the meantime, Ethan was expelled, socially destroyed, and effectively erased from Riverside Academy's community. His scholarship offers from colleges evaporated. Universities that had been recruiting him sent polite emails withdrawing their interest, citing concerns about character and institutional reputation. Ethan stopped answering his phone after the first week. I'd called a few times, sent messages saying I didn't know what to believe, but I was willing to listen if he wanted to talk. He never responded. His family stopped coming to public places. Mira transferred to a different school district to escape the harassment. The Volkov's house, which had always been warm and welcoming with an open-door policy for Ethan's teammates and friends, became closed and dark. Curtains drawn, cars in the garage, no signs of life except occasionally when someone had to leave for essential errands. I drove past once and saw Mrs. Volkov getting mail from the curb. She looked like she'd aged a decade in 2 weeks, moving with the heaviness of someone carrying unbearable weight. I wanted to stop and say something, but what could I possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow or offensive? I kept driving and added that cowardice to the growing list of ways I'd failed someone who'd been a real friend to me. The basketball season continued without Ethan. We were losing games we should have won. The team chemistry had collapsed. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that we were struggling because our best player was gone, because acknowledging that felt like defending a rapist. Coach Thornton kept saying we needed to focus on the players who were there, who'd earned the right to wear the uniform. The implication was clear. Ethan hadn't earned anything. He'd been a predator masquerading as a leader. 3 weeks after the expulsion, Vanessa gave an interview to the local news. She was filmed in silhouette to protect her identity, speaking about the importance of believing survivors and the courage it took to come forward against someone popular and powerful. She described how Ethan had used his status as a star athlete to make her feel like nobody would believe her if she reported, how the school community's initial support had meant everything to her healing process. The interview went viral locally and then regionally. Vanessa became a symbol of brave survivorship. The school organized an assembly about sexual violence prevention and consent education. Vanessa was invited to speak, still maintaining some anonymity but allowing people to see her, to put a face to the survivor narrative. She spoke about trauma and healing and the importance of community support for victims. The assembly felt performative to me in ways I couldn't articulate, but I applauded along with everyone else because not applauding would mark me as a rape apologist. After the assembly, I overheard Vice Principal Raines telling Vanessa how proud he was of her courage, how she was helping other victims find their voices. His concern seemed genuine, paternal even. He'd been the administrator who'd pushed hardest for Ethan's immediate expulsion, arguing that the school had a duty to protect students from credible threats. I don't know what made me start questioning the narrative. Maybe it was seeing Ethan's sister crying alone in the library one afternoon. Or maybe it was the uncomfortable feeling that something about Vanessa's story didn't quite align with the Ethan I'd known for years. I told myself that predators fooled people, that I couldn't trust my personal impressions over a victim's testimony. But small inconsistencies kept nagging at me. Vanessa had said the assault happened around 11 p.m. at a party on Hillside Drive. I'd been at that party. I'd left around 10:30 p.m., and Ethan had left before me, maybe around 10 p.m., because he'd told me he had an early morning workout. I'd watched him say goodbye to people and walk to his car. I hadn't seen Vanessa at all that night, though the party was crowded enough that not seeing someone didn't mean they weren't there. But Ethan leaving early contradicted the timeline Vanessa had provided. I mentioned this discrepancy to another teammate, Austin Lee, and he looked at me with disappointment and said, "Are you really trying to poke holes in a rape victim's story? Maybe your timeline is wrong. Maybe Ethan came back. Stop trying to defend him." I dropped it immediately, feeling ashamed for even raising the question. But the doubt remained, quiet and persistent. I started paying more attention to Vanessa at school, not in a creepy way, just noticing her behavior and interactions. She seemed remarkably composed for someone who'd recently experienced trauma and was now publicly identified as a survivor. She was attending classes regularly, participating actively, appearing in yearbook photos for various clubs. Trauma responses varied widely, and I knew that some survivors threw themselves into normal activities as coping mechanisms. But something about how she held court with other students, accepting their sympathy and support with practiced grace, felt off to me. I noticed that Vice Principal Rains checked on her frequently, stopping by her locker between classes, pulling her aside for quiet conversations. Again, that could be appropriate administrative support for a student who'd reported assault. But the frequency felt unusual. I started documenting when I saw them interact, keeping a log on my phone that felt absurd even as I created it. What was I doing? Playing detective in a sexual assault case where a victim was being supported and a predator had been expelled? I felt disgusted with myself for doubting her, but I couldn't stop noticing patterns that seemed wrong. The police investigation concluded after 4 weeks. The district attorney's office announced they would not be pursuing criminal charges against Ethan due to insufficient evidence. The statement clarified that insufficient evidence didn't mean the assault hadn't occurred, just that they couldn't prove it beyond reasonable doubt in a criminal trial. Vanessa's supporters immediately organized protests, arguing that the justice system was failing survivors yet again. Ethan's parents issued another statement expressing relief, but also devastation, at how their son had been treated despite never being criminally charged. They said Ethan was considering a civil lawsuit for defamation, but honestly, after everything he'd been through, he just wanted to move forward with his life somewhere far from Riverside. That statement sparked another wave of outrage. How dare he consider suing his victim? How dare his parents enable his predatory behavior? The Volkov family's social media accounts were flooded with threats and harassment. Someone created a website cataloging Ethan's supposed crimes and calling for continued social consequences, even though the legal system had failed. The website included the family's home address and his parents' business information, effectively encouraging people to continue targeting them. I looked at that website with growing horror, wondering when we'd all become a mob willing to destroy a family based on an accusation that hadn't resulted in charges. Ethan disappeared on a Wednesday in late October. His parents reported him missing after he didn't come home from what he'd said was a drive to clear his head. His car was found 2 days later in a parking area near Riverside Trail, a hiking spot in the woods outside town. There was no sign of Ethan. The police organized search parties. Despite everything, dozens of community members volunteered to search the woods and trails. I volunteered because regardless of what I believed about the assault allegation, I didn't want Ethan dead or hurt. We spent hours walking through cold November woods calling his name, checking ravines and water sources, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. The search stretched across 4 days with no results. Dogs tracked his scent from the car to a point along the river trail, then lost it near the water. The implication was obvious, but nobody wanted to say it directly. On the 5th day, a kayaker found Ethan's body caught in branches about 3 miles downstream from where the trail met the river. He'd been in the water for days. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was drowning, with no signs of foul play. The manner of death was ruled suicide. Ethan Volkov had walked into the river and drowned himself at 17 years old. The news of his death created a complicated grief in Riverside Academy. People who'd been calling him a rapist and celebrating his expulsion suddenly had to confront that their target was dead. The dominant narrative quickly became that this tragedy demonstrated how seriously we needed to take sexual violence, that the trauma of being held accountable had driven Ethan to take his own life, which was devastating, but didn't change what he'd done to Vanessa. Vanessa herself released a statement through Vice Principal Rains saying she was heartbroken by Ethan's death, that she'd never wanted this outcome, that she hoped people would remember that survivors often carried guilt when their abusers faced consequences. The statement felt wrong to me in ways I couldn't articulate. Why was she releasing statements through Rains instead of directly? Why did every public comment feel so carefully constructed? At the funeral, which I attended despite social pressure not to, Mrs. Volkov was barely functional with grief. She kept saying her boy had been innocent, that he'd been murdered by a lie, that everyone who'd participated in destroying him had his blood on their hands. People wrote her off as a mother in denial, unable to accept her son's actions. But I looked at her destroyed face and thought about the Ethan I'd known, and I couldn't make the pieces fit together in a way that felt true. After the funeral, I went to the river where Ethan's body had been found. I'm not sure what I was looking for, maybe closure or understanding or some sign that would tell me what really happened. The parking area was empty. I walked the trail to where it met the river, stood on the bank looking at the cold water, and tried to imagine what had been going through Ethan's mind in his final moments. Had he been consumed by guilt for something he'd done? Or had he been destroyed by being falsely accused and abandoned by everyone he'd trusted? I sat on a fallen log and went through my phone, rereading the messages I'd sent Ethan that he'd never answered. The last one was from 3 days before he disappeared. I don't know what happened, but you were a good friend to me. If you need someone to listen, I'm here. He'd read it, but never responded. I wondered if he'd considered reaching out, if having one person believe him might have changed his decision to walk into that water. I was sitting there drowning in guilt and confusion when I noticed something caught in the branches near the bank. A plastic bag wrapped around a broken branch, the kind of waterproof bag hikers use for electronics. I pulled it loose and found a phone inside. Ethan's phone. I recognized the case immediately, a team photo we'd taken after winning state championships. The phone was dead, but it had been protected from water damage by the bag. I should have turned the phone over to police immediately. Instead, I took it home and charged it, telling myself I just wanted to see if there was anything on it that would help me understand why he'd done this. The phone came to life after an hour of charging. It wasn't password protected, which seemed odd until I realized Ethan had probably removed the security so someone would be able to access it if they found it. He'd left this phone deliberately, wanted it found. I opened his messages first and found thousands of hate messages from people I knew, people I went to school with, adults from the community, threats of violence, rape threats, wishes for his death, all sent to a 17-year-old kid who'd never been charged with a crime. Reading through them made me physically sick. But what made me stop breathing was a message thread with Vice Principal Rains from 2 months ago, before the assault allegation. Ethan had written, "I have evidence that you've been selling test answers and changing grades for students whose parents pay you. I've documented everything. I'm coming to you first because I don't want to destroy your career, but this has to stop." Rains had responded, "You have no idea what you're talking about. Making false accusations against school administrators is a serious offense that will result in your expulsion. I suggest you focus on basketball and forget whatever you think you saw." I scrolled through more messages and found screenshots Ethan had saved. Venmo transactions between Rains and several parents, always labeled with innocent-sounding descriptions, but occurring right before grade changes in the school database. Ethan had access to the database because he'd been a student aide in the administrative office, helping with filing and data entry. He'd noticed patterns of grade changes that didn't correspond with any legitimate academic work, noticed that the students receiving unexplained grade improvements had parents making payments to Rains. He'd documented it methodically, preparing to report to the school board and state education department. The evidence was comprehensive and damning. Rains had been running an academic fraud operation for at least 2 years, taking payments from wealthy parents to alter their children's grades and give them access to test materials. The amounts varied from $5,000 to $20,000 per student. He'd made at least $300,000 from the scheme based on the transactions Ethan had captured. And Ethan had threatened to expose all of it unless Rains stopped. I kept scrolling and found more messages, these ones between Ethan and Vanessa from 4 months ago. Friendly conversations about a history project they'd worked on together, nothing romantic or inappropriate. Then a gap with no messages. Then a message from Vanessa, 3 weeks before the assault allegation. "I'm so sorry I didn't want to do this. Please understand, I didn't have a choice." Ethan had responded, "What are you talking about?" She never replied. I sat, staring at the phone, trying to process what I was seeing. Ethan had evidence of criminal fraud. Rains had threatened him. Vanessa had apologized for something before making the assault allegation. The pieces were arranging themselves into a picture that made my blood run cold. I opened Ethan's photos and found more documentation. Photos of Raines's office computer screen showing grade database changes. Photos of checks made out to Raines from various parents. Photos of emails where Raines communicated with parents about improving their children's academic records. And then I found a video file dated 3 days before the assault allegation. I pressed play and watched Ethan sitting in his car filming himself. My name is Ethan Volkov. If you're watching this, something has happened to me. Vice Principal Dominic Raines is running a fraud operation at Riverside Academy. I have evidence that he's been taking bribes from parents to change grades and provide test materials. I reported this to him directly, and he threatened me with expulsion if I went public. Yesterday, he approached me and said that if I didn't destroy my evidence and stay quiet, he would destroy me in ways I couldn't imagine. He specifically mentioned that accusations of sexual assault would end my basketball career and college prospects. I'm documenting this because I'm scared. I don't know what he's planning, but I need people to know the truth if something happens. The video ended. I played it 3 more times, watching Ethan's face as he explained the situation with a calmness that barely concealed his fear. I finally understood what had happened. Raines had orchestrated the entire assault allegation to neutralize Ethan's threat to expose the fraud operation. He'd pressured or paid Vanessa to make a false report, timing it strategically to destroy Ethan's credibility before he could release the evidence of Raines's crimes. The school had expelled Ethan immediately. No investigation, no due process, just instant removal. That speed made sense now. Raines had pushed for immediate expulsion to prevent Ethan from accessing school resources or speaking to other students about what he knew. The community had done the rest, destroying Ethan so thoroughly that even if he'd tried to release his evidence, nobody would have believed him. He'd been branded a rapist. Anything he said would be dismissed as desperate deflection. Raines had weaponized sexual assault allegations and community outrage to eliminate a whistleblower, and everyone had participated enthusiastically in the destruction, including me. I'd doubted my friend. I'd stayed silent while he was erased. I'd protected myself instead of standing with someone who'd been telling the truth. And now Ethan was dead because nobody had believed him. I looked at the phone in my hands and realized I was holding evidence that could expose everything. But I also knew that coming forward would make me a target for the same treatment Ethan had received. People would say I was lying to defend a rapist. Vanessa's supporters would attack me. Raines would deny everything, and I'd be expelled for making false accusations against an administrator. I spent that entire night going through everything on Ethan's phone, making copies of all the evidence, uploading files to secure cloud storage, documenting every detail. By morning, I'd created a comprehensive package showing Raines's fraud operation and the timeline that suggested the assault allegation had been fabricated to silence Ethan. But I knew that releasing this evidence myself wouldn't be effective. I was just another student, easily dismissed or attacked. I needed someone with authority and credibility who couldn't be immediately dismissed. I thought about who in the community might listen, who had the power to force a real investigation. My mind kept coming back to Detective Allison Crawford, the investigator who'd handled the sexual assault case. She'd been thorough and professional, hadn't seemed invested in any particular outcome, just following the evidence. If I could get her to review what I'd found, maybe she could force the department to reopen everything. I called the police station and asked to speak with Detective Crawford privately about new evidence in the Ethan Volkov case. The receptionist tried to tell me the case was closed, but I insisted it was urgent and related to his death. An hour later, I was sitting in a small conference room at the police station with Detective Crawford reviewing Ethan's phone while she took notes. Detective Crawford's expression shifted from professional courtesy to focused intensity as she reviewed the evidence. She watched Ethan's video 3 times, asked me detailed questions about where I'd found the phone and why I'd waited to bring it in, documented everything methodically. Then she asked me about Vanessa's allegation and whether I had any direct knowledge of what had happened at the party. I told her about the timeline inconsistency I'd noticed, about Ethan leaving early, about Vanessa's message apologizing before making the report. She pulled up her case file and spent 20 minutes cross-referencing details with what I was telling her. Finally, she closed the file and said, "The assault investigation was handled properly based on the information we had. But this evidence suggests the allegation may have been fabricated as part of a conspiracy to silence a whistleblower. If that's true, we're looking at fraud, extortion, possibly filing a false police report, and a wrongful death that resulted from criminal conspiracy. This goes way beyond school politics. She said she'd need to bring in other investigators, and likely the state attorney general's office, given the scope of the fraud operation. She asked if I was prepared for the fallout from coming forward, whether I understood that I'd face significant backlash from people who believed Vanessa. I said I understood, but I owed it to Ethan to tell the truth, even if it destroyed my reputation the way his had been destroyed. The investigation exploded into public view within 48 hours. State police executed search warrants at Raines' home and office, seizing computers and financial records. Raines was arrested on charges of fraud, bribery, extortion, and conspiracy. Vanessa was brought in for questioning, and after 6 hours of interview, she broke down and admitted that Raines had paid her $15,000 to make a false assault allegation against Ethan. She said Raines had approached her 2 months before the report, knowing her family was struggling financially after her father lost his job. He'd told her that Ethan was dangerous and planning to make false accusations against school administrators, and that they needed to stop him before he hurt innocent people. He'd coached her on what to say, helped her craft a detailed and credible story, told her exactly how to report it for maximum impact. She'd felt sick about it from the beginning, but had been terrified of Raines and desperate for the money. After Ethan died, she'd wanted to confess, but Raines had threatened her family and said she'd go to prison for filing a false report. Now she was cooperating fully with investigators and admitting everything. The news that the assault allegation had been fabricated, that Ethan had been innocent and had been destroyed for trying to expose corruption, sent shockwaves through Riverside and beyond. The community response was fractured and defensive. Some people immediately expressed horror and regret for how they'd treated Ethan. Others insisted that we should still believe survivors and that this one false allegation didn't negate legitimate victims' experiences. Some argued that Vanessa was the real victim, coerced by a powerful administrator into making a false report. People who'd been most vicious in attacking Ethan suddenly claimed they'd always had doubts, that they'd been pressured by social media mob mentality. The cognitive dissonance was stunning to watch. Principal Whitmore and the school board held an emergency meeting and announced that Ethan's expulsion was being posthumously rescinded, his academic and athletic records would be fully restored, and the school would be implementing new due process procedures to ensure students received fair investigation before disciplinary action. These announcements felt hollow and infuriating. Ethan was dead. Restoring his records and apologizing couldn't bring him back. The people responsible for his death weren't just Raines and Vanessa. It was every person who'd participated in destroying him without waiting for evidence. Every student who'd sent him death threats. Every teacher who'd treated him as guilty without trial. Every community member who'd vandalized his family's property and driven them into hiding. We had all killed him. Some of us more directly than others, but we'd all participated in creating the conditions that made walking into a river seem preferable to continuing to exist in a world that had branded him a monster. The criminal trials took months to proceed through the system. Raines faced 14 charges including fraud, bribery, conspiracy to file a false police report, and criminally negligent homicide based on the argument that his orchestration of the false allegation had directly led to Ethan's death. His defense tried to argue that he couldn't have predicted Ethan would commit suicide, that intervening actions by other people had contributed to the outcome. The prosecution presented Ethan's video and the evidence showing Raines had specifically threatened to destroy him with sexual assault allegations, demonstrating premeditation and knowledge of the likely consequences. Multiple parents testified about paying Raines for grade changes, providing detailed documentation of the fraud operation. The jury convicted on all counts. He received 23 years in federal prison. Vanessa was tried separately on charges of filing a false police report and fraud. Her defense argued she'd been manipulated and coerced by Raines, that she was essentially a victim herself. The prosecution acknowledged the coercion, but argued she'd still made conscious choices to participate in destroying an innocent person's life. She was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by probation. Multiple parents who'd participated in the academic fraud scheme faced charges and civil penalties. The school board members who'd approved Ethan's immediate expulsion without investigation were forced to resign. The civil lawsuit that the Volkov family filed against the school district, Raines, Vanessa, and several individual community members who'd engaged in harassment was settled for $8.7 million. The district admitted no wrongdoing but agreed to implement comprehensive policy changes regarding student discipline, due process, and protection against false allegations. Money couldn't heal the Volkov family's devastation, but it was acknowledgement that what had been done to Ethan was catastrophically wrong. Mrs. Volkov used a portion of the settlement to establish a foundation focused on protecting accused students' rights to due process and providing support for people falsely accused of crimes. The foundation was named for Ethan, and his story became a cautionary tale used in discussions about mob justice, social media pile-ons, and the importance of presumption of innocence. Mira eventually came back to Riverside Academy for her senior year, though she maintained careful distance from most students. I tried to apologize to her once for not standing by her brother, and she looked at me with empty eyes and said nothing before walking away. I didn't blame her. Words were inadequate for the magnitude of what we'd done to her family. The basketball team never recovered. We finished the season with a losing record. Coach Thornton was fired for his role in erasing Ethan from team history without investigation. The state championship banners that had Ethan's name removed were destroyed and replaced with new ones that honored him appropriately. These gestures felt performative and insufficient, but people needed to do something to demonstrate remorse. I couldn't play basketball anymore after everything that happened. Every time I touched a ball, I thought about Ethan and how I'd let him down when he needed someone to believe him. I quit the team halfway through senior year. Austin and several other teammates did the same. The program that had been Riverside Academy's pride became something people avoided out of shame. Vanessa's friends and supporters fractured into groups with different interpretations of what had happened. Some maintained she was a victim of Raines's manipulation and deserved compassion. Others felt betrayed that they'd believed her story and attacked Ethan based on her lies. The nuance of acknowledging that she'd been coerced while also holding her accountable for her choices proved too complicated for most people. It was easier to categorize her as either victim or villain than to recognize she was both. I graduated from Riverside Academy 6 months after Ethan's body was found. The graduation ceremony felt muted and joyless. Nobody mentioned Ethan directly, but his absence haunted every moment. Mrs. Volkov attended, sitting alone in the back of the auditorium, watching the class that should have included her son receive diplomas. I saw her crying silently during the principal's address about integrity and community values. The hypocrisy was suffocating. I'd been accepted to several colleges but deferred enrollment for a year because I couldn't imagine moving forward with normal life after everything. I needed time to process what we'd done and who I'd become when tested. I'd discovered I was someone who protected himself over his friends, someone who stayed silent rather than risk social consequences, someone who participated in destroying an innocent person through cowardice. That knowledge was hard to live with. I started volunteering with the foundation Mrs. Volkov had established, helping develop educational programs about due process and the dangers of rushing to judgment. The work felt insufficient, but necessary. It was the only way I could think to honor Ethan's memory and maybe prevent other families from experiencing what the Volkovs had survived. 4 years later, I'm 22 and still processing what happened at Riverside Academy. I study criminal justice now, specifically focused on wrongful convictions and false accusations, trying to understand the systems that failed Ethan so I can help fix them for others. Mrs. Volkov and I stay in contact. She's become a national advocate for due process reforms in schools and criminal justice systems. Mira is in college studying law, planning to specialize in civil rights. The Volkov family transformed their grief into purpose, which doesn't heal the wound, but gives the pain meaning. Raines serves his sentence at a federal facility. Vanessa was released after 3 years and moved across the country, trying to rebuild a life away from people who knew her story. The parents who paid for grade changes faced varying consequences depending on their level of cooperation with investigators. Some lost jobs, some faced only financial penalties, some rebuilt their reputations despite their participation in the fraud scheme. Riverside Academy implemented extensive policy changes that other schools adopted, using Ethan's case as an example of what happens when institutions prioritize reputation over fairness. I think about Ethan every day, wonder what he'd be doing now if we'd believed him. Wonder what college he'd have attended, what career he'd have pursued, what kind of man he'd have become. The world lost someone good because we were too quick to believe the worst, too willing to destroy rather than investigate, too comfortable participating in mob justice that felt righteous but was actually murder disguised as accountability. I carry that guilt, knowing I was there when he needed someone to stand with him, and I chose silence instead. The only way I know to live with that is to make sure other people in similar situations have someone who doesn't abandon them. It doesn't balance the scales, but it's the work I have to do for the rest of my life. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.